Rome had a secret weapon. It wasn't their legions. It wasn't their roads. It wasn't even their famous aqueducts. It was something so disgusting that historians refused to write about it seriously for centuries. I'm talking about human waste. Specifically, the fact that the Roman Empire literally ran on it. Emperors taxed it. Armies were fed because of it. Industries depended on it. And one specific sewer, built 600 years before the birth of Christ, is still standing today, still functioning, still carrying waste through tunnels that were constructed before the Colosseum even existed. This is the story they don't teach you in history class. And by the end, you'll understand why the rise and fall of Rome had as much to do with sewage as it did with senators. But first, I need you to forget everything you think you know about ancient Rome. Forget the gladiators for a moment. Forget the emperors in their purple robes. Forget the legions marching across Europe. Because today we're going underground. We're going into the filth. And we're going to discover that the greatest empire in human history was built on a foundation of human waste. Welcome back to Ash and Crown History, where we dig into the stories that shaped our world. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss our deep dives into the hidden corners of history. Trust me, this channel is going to take you places your history teachers never dared to go. Now, let's start with a problem. A really, really big problem. Picture Rome at its absolute height. We're talking about the 2nd century AD, during the reign of emperors like Trajan and Hadrian. The empire stretches from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. And at the center of it all sits the city of Rome itself. 1 million people. Let that sink in for a moment. 1 million human beings, crammed into roughly 5 square miles of urban space. To put that in perspective, that's denser than modern-day Manhattan. Denser than Tokyo. Denser than any city you've probably ever visited. And every single one of those million people had the same basic biological needs that you and I have. They ate, they drank, and then, inevitably, they had to deal with what came next. Let's do some math that no Roman senator probably wanted to think about. The average human produces about 1 to 2 pounds of feces per day, plus around half a gallon of urine. Multiply that by 1 million people, and you get somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 pounds of solid waste and 500,000 gallons of liquid waste. Every single day, day after day, year after year, for centuries. Now imagine you're standing in the Roman Forum on a hot August afternoon. The marble columns gleam in the Mediterranean sun. Senators in pristine white togas debate matters of state. Merchants from across the known world hawk their exotic wares. Soldiers march past in polished armor. It looks exactly like the movies. Now take a deep breath. That smell hitting your nostrils? That's the smell of empire. And I promise you, it was not pleasant. So here's the question that should be forming in your mind right now. How did they deal with it? How did a civilization sophisticated enough to build the Pantheon and engineer roads that still exist today handle the most basic and most disgusting human problem? What did they do with all that waste? The answer is going to take us on a journey through engineering marvels, public toilets that functioned as networking events, a literal goddess of sewers, an emperor who got rich taxing urine, and a system so brilliantly designed that parts of it still function after 2,600 years. But the answer also involves slavery, disease, catastrophic plagues, and a collapse so complete that Europe wouldn't see sanitation this advanced again for over 1,000 years. Let's start at the beginning. And I mean the very beginning. 700 years before Christ. Rome isn't an empire yet. It's barely even a city. Just a collection of villages scattered across 7 hills overlooking a swampy valley where the Tiber River floods regularly. Those floods leave behind stagnant pools of water, breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and a general sense that this might not be the best place to build a civilization. But the early Romans were stubborn. Instead of moving somewhere more sensible, they decided to fix the problem. And the solution they came up with would shape the next 3,000 years of urban planning. They started digging. The project began around 600 BC, during the reign of the Etruscan kings who ruled Rome before the Republic. What started as simple drainage ditches to channel floodwater away from the valley gradually evolved into something far more ambitious. Workers, many of them slaves and war captives, carved channels through the earth, lined them with stone, and created a network of underground passages designed to carry water away from the city center. They called it the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain. And here's where I need you to understand something crucial. This wasn't just a sewer in the way we think of sewers today. The Cloaca Maxima was, for its time, one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history. We're talking about tunnels large enough to drive a wagon through. Stone archways that have survived earthquakes, floods, wars, and the fall of multiple civilizations. A system so over-engineered that it still carries water through Rome today, more than 2.5 millennia after it was built. The main trunk of the Cloaca Maxima stretched for about 1/3 of a mile in its original form, but as Rome grew, the system expanded with it. Smaller channels connected to larger ones. Drainage from public buildings fed into the network. Eventually, the system included hundreds of miles of underground passages, all designed to carry waste and stormwater to the Tiber River. Now, I know what you're thinking. They just dumped everything in the river? Isn't that just moving the problem somewhere else? Yes, absolutely yes. And we'll get to the consequences of that later. But for now, understand that by ancient standards, this was revolutionary. Most cities at the time dealt with waste by simply throwing it in the streets and hoping for the best. Athens, the cradle of democracy and philosophy, was famous for its terrible sanitation. Cities in Mesopotamia, despite their advanced civilizations, regularly dealt with waste-related plagues. But Rome had a system, and that system gave them an advantage that's hard to overstate. Think about what happens in a city without sanitation. Waste accumulates. It attracts vermin. Those vermin carry diseases. People get sick. They can't work. The economy suffers. More people die. The city weakens. Now think about a city with even basic sanitation. Waste gets removed. There are fewer breeding grounds for rats and mosquitoes, fewer epidemics, a healthier workforce, a stronger economy, a more powerful military. The Cloaca Maxima wasn't just a drain. It was a competitive advantage. It was infrastructure that made empire possible. But the Romans didn't stop at engineering. They did something even more remarkable. They turned their sewer into a religious institution. Meet Cloacina, the goddess of the sewer. I'm not making this up. The Romans literally had a goddess dedicated to their drainage system. Cloacina started out as an Etruscan deity associated with purification and cleanliness. When the Romans built the Cloaca Maxima, They adopted her as the divine protector of their great drain. A small shrine to Cloacina stood near the entrance to the main sewer, where Romans would make offerings to ensure the continued functioning of their sanitation system. This tells us something profound about how the Romans thought about waste management. It wasn't just a practical concern. It was a sacred duty. The functioning of the sewers was considered essential to the health and prosperity of the city, important enough to deserve divine protection. Imagine if modern cities treated their sanitation workers with that kind of reverence. But I digress. The Cloaca Maxima handled drainage and carried away waste that made it into the system. But here's a question that might have occurred to you. How did the waste get into the system in the first place? What was happening at street level? This brings us to one of the strangest and most fascinating aspects of Roman daily life: the public latrine. I want you to picture something. You're a Roman merchant. You've just finished a long morning of negotiations at the Forum. Nature calls. Where do you go? You head to the nearest public latrine. You push through the doorway and find yourself in a long room, often beautifully decorated with mosaics and frescoes. Running water gurgles through a channel beneath a stone bench that lines the walls. On that bench, carved at regular intervals, are keyhole-shaped openings. And seated at those openings, their togas hitched up around their waists, are a dozen of your fellow citizens. There are no partitions, no doors, no privacy whatsoever. Just men sitting side by side, doing their business while conducting business. This is what the Romans considered a normal bathroom experience. And far from being embarrassed by it, they seemed to embrace the communal nature of the arrangement. Public latrines were social spaces. People would catch up on gossip, discuss politics, negotiate deals, and generally use the opportunity to network. Some latrines even had heating systems beneath the seats to make the experience more comfortable during winter months. The logistics of these facilities were actually quite sophisticated. Water from the aqueducts flowed continuously through channels beneath the seats, carrying waste away to the sewers. A shallow channel of clean water ran in front of the seats, where users could rinse their hands. Some facilities even had attendants who maintained the space and provided services to users. But here's where it gets interesting, and also kind of gross. You know how in modern bathrooms we have toilet paper? The Romans didn't have that. What they had instead was called a tersorium. Picture a sea sponge attached to the end of a wooden stick. Users would dip the sponge in the water channel in front of them, use it to clean themselves, rinse it off, and leave it for the next person. Yes, they shared the same sponge with strangers. I'll give you a moment to process that. By modern standards, this seems horrifyingly unhygienic. And honestly, it probably was. The tersorium was almost certainly a vector for disease transmission. But here's the thing. By the standards of the ancient world, even this was relatively advanced. Most civilizations didn't have any systematic approach to this particular problem. The Romans at least had a system, even if that system involved sharing cleaning implements with strangers. And the public latrines, despite their lack of privacy and their questionable hygiene practices, were genuinely popular. We know this because there were a lot of them. Archaeological evidence suggests that Rome had hundreds of public latrines scattered throughout the city. Some were simple affairs, just a few seats over a drain. Others were elaborate facilities attached to bath complexes, designed to provide a complete hygienic experience. The largest known Roman latrine was discovered in the port city of Ostia and could accommodate about 80 users simultaneously. Imagine walking into that room. 80 people, all in a row. No walls between them, just the sounds of conversation and, well, other sounds. Now, you might be wondering about the women of Rome. Did they use these facilities too? The evidence is mixed. Some latrines seem to have been male only, while others may have had separate sections for women. Some scholars believe that wealthy Roman women rarely used public facilities at all, preferring to use chamber pots at home. But working-class women and slave women probably had fewer options. This brings up an important point that we need to address. Not everyone in Rome had equal access to sanitation. If you were wealthy, you might have a private latrine in your home, connected to the sewer system by your own personal drain. If you were poor, you probably shared a latrine with your entire apartment building, and that latrine might not be connected to the sewers at all. It might just be a pot that someone carried out and emptied periodically. And if you lived on the upper floors of one of Rome's notorious insulae, the towering apartment blocks that housed the urban poor, your relationship with sanitation was even more complicated. Those buildings often had no running water above the ground floor. Climbing down several flights of stairs every time you needed to relieve yourself was inconvenient at best. The tempting alternative was to simply empty your chamber pot out the window and hope nobody was walking below. This actually happened frequently enough that Rome had laws against it. If you injured someone by throwing waste out your window, you were liable for damages. The fact that such laws existed tells us how common the practice was. Walking through certain neighborhoods in Rome must have required constant vigilance, looking up as much as looking ahead. So we have a city with an advanced underground drainage system, public latrines for communal use, and a wealthy class with private facilities. But we still haven't addressed what might be the most surprising aspect of Roman waste management: the economics. Because here's the thing about waste in ancient Rome. It wasn't just something to be disposed of. It was a commodity, a resource, and for some people it was a path to wealth. Let's talk about urine. I know, not exactly dinner conversation, but this is important, and honestly it's also kind of fascinating. Urine contains ammonia. When urine breaks down, bacteria convert the urea it contains into ammonia, a powerful cleaning agent and bleaching compound. The Romans knew this, though they didn't understand the chemistry. What they understood was that aged urine worked incredibly well for certain industrial processes. Enter the fullers. Fullers were specialized workers in the Roman textile industry. Their job was to clean, whiten, and process woolen cloth. Fresh wool came off the loom full of natural oils and impurities. It was the fuller's task to transform that raw fabric into the bright white togas that were the hallmark of Roman citizenship. And their secret ingredient? Human urine. Here's how it worked. Fullers would collect urine in large vats, often placed on street corners for public contributions. Yes, there were containers on Roman street corners specifically for people to urinate into. After collecting enough urine, they would let it age until the ammonia smell became overwhelming. Then pour it into large tubs where workers would stomp on the fabric with their feet, essentially washing it in fermented human waste. I want you to picture that job. Standing in a tub of aged urine, stomping on cloth for hours at a time. The smell must have been indescribable. Fuller workers were probably identifiable from a considerable distance by their odor alone. Their feet were likely stained and damaged from constant exposure to ammonia. It was brutal, unpleasant work. But here's the remarkable thing. This process worked really well. The ammonia in the aged urine cut through the oils in the wool, whitened the fabric, and produced a product that was cleaner and brighter than anything that could be achieved with just water and soap. Roman togas were famous for their brilliant whiteness, and that brilliance was achieved through human waste. The fuller industry was big business in Rome. There were entire districts dedicated to the trade. Wealthy entrepreneurs owned strings of fooleries and employed dozens of workers. The industry consumed enormous quantities of urine, creating a genuine demand for what most civilizations considered worthless waste. This brings us to one of my favorite stories in all of Roman history, the story of Emperor Vespasian and his urine tax. Vespasian became emperor in 69 AD, at the end of a brutal civil war that had seen 4 different emperors in a single year. The empire was broke. The treasury was empty. And Vespasian, a practical military man from a middle-class family, needed to find money somewhere. So he looked around and noticed something interesting. All that urine being collected from public latrines and street corner containers was being sold to fullers for profit. Money was changing hands. And whenever money changed hands, Vespasian saw an opportunity for taxation. He imposed a tax on the collection and sale of urine, the vectigal urine, literally the urine tax. Now, Vespasian's son Titus was apparently appalled by this. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, Titus complained to his father about the disgusting nature of this revenue source. Vespasian's response became one of the most famous quotes in Roman history. He held up a gold coin from the first tax collection and said, "Pecunia non olet." Money doesn't stink. That phrase has survived for 2,000 years. We still use it today to describe profits from unsavory sources. And it captures something essential about the Roman attitude toward waste. They weren't squeamish about it. They saw the practical value in things that other civilizations would have simply discarded. If there was money to be made, they would find a way to make it. The urine tax was just one example of this pragmatic approach. There was another industry built on human waste that was even larger and more essential to the functioning of the empire. The night soil trade. Night soil is a polite term for what is essentially processed human feces. And in ancient Rome it was valuable. Very valuable. Here's the agricultural reality of the ancient world. Soil gets depleted. If you farm the same land year after year without replenishing the nutrients, your yields will decline. Crop rotation helps, but it's not enough. What you really need is fertilizer. The Romans didn't have chemical fertilizers. They didn't have guano imports from Peru. What they had was an endless supply of human waste from the largest city in the world. And they found a way to turn that problem into a solution. Private contractors, known as stercorarii, made their living collecting waste from homes, apartment buildings, and public facilities throughout the city. They would transport this material out to the farms that surrounded Rome, where it was spread on fields to replenish the soil. The human waste of 1 million people helped feed those same 1,000,000 people. It's a crude form of what we would today call a circular economy. Waste becoming resource. The end of one process becoming the beginning of another. The Romans stumbled onto principles of sustainability that we're only now rediscovering. The night soil trade was logistically complex. Collectors needed to move through the city, gathering waste from hundreds of locations. They needed transport, probably carts pulled by donkeys or mules. They needed to work at night, when the streets were less crowded and the smell would be less noticeable. Hence the name. And they needed somewhere to take their product. The farms that purchased night soil were mostly located outside the city, requiring trips of several miles. Some waste was probably processed first, allowed to decompose in pits until it was less offensive and more agriculturally useful. Other waste might have been sold immediately to farmers who would do their own processing. The economics of this trade are hard to reconstruct, but it was clearly profitable enough to attract entrepreneurs. There are legal records of disputes over night soil collection rights, suggesting that territories were divided up and defended. In some cases, apartment building owners may have charged collectors for the privilege of removing waste from their properties. In other cases, collectors may have paid for access to particularly productive sources. Think about what this means for our understanding of Roman society. There were people, probably many people, whose entire livelihood depended on human waste. They were essential workers in the truest sense, keeping the city functional by removing what it couldn't contain. And they were simultaneously despised as the lowest of the low, doing work that no respectable person would touch. We don't know much about these workers as individuals. Their names aren't recorded in the histories. They don't appear in Roman literature as characters. They were invisible despite being essential. But their work made everything else possible. Without the night soil collectors, Rome would have drowned in its own waste within weeks. This brings us to an uncomfortable but important topic. Who actually did this work? Who built the sewers, cleaned the latrines, collected the night soil, and stomped in the urine vats? The answer, overwhelmingly, was slaves. The Roman economy ran on slave labor, and the sanitation industry was no exception. Slaves dug the tunnels of the Cloaca Maxima. Slaves maintained the public latrines. Slaves worked in the fooleries. Slaves collected and transported night soil. The entire system that made Rome function was built on the backs of people who had no choice in the matter. This is important to understand because it affects how we think about Roman achievements in sanitation. Yes, they built impressive systems. Yes, those systems worked. But they worked because there was an enslaved population available to do the work that free citizens refused to do. When we talk about Roman engineering genius, we need to remember that genius was expressed through brutality. The tunnels of the Cloaca Maxima were carved by hand, by workers who were considered property rather than people. The gleaming white togas of Roman senators were cleaned in human waste by workers who could be bought and sold like furniture. This doesn't mean the engineering wasn't impressive. It doesn't mean we can't learn from Roman innovations. But it does mean we need to be careful about romanticizing the Roman approach to sanitation. Their system worked for the people it was designed to serve, primarily wealthy citizens. For everyone else, especially slaves, the experience was probably quite different. And even for free citizens, the Roman system had serious limitations that we should address. Let's talk about disease. Despite their advanced infrastructure, Romans got sick. A lot. The city was periodically ravaged by epidemics that killed thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. And many of these epidemics were probably related to sanitation, directly or indirectly. Here's the problem with the Roman approach. They understood that waste needed to be removed from populated areas, but they didn't understand why. They didn't have germ theory. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. They thought disease was caused by bad air, the miasma theory that would dominate medical thinking until the 19th century. So while they moved waste out of the city center, they didn't necessarily prevent disease transmission. The Tiber River, into which all the sewage ultimately flowed, was still used as a water source by some residents. The shared sponges in public latrines were breeding grounds for intestinal parasites. The open drains that carried waste through the streets were accessible to rats and other vermin. Archaeological evidence has confirmed what we might suspect. Roman intestinal parasites were everywhere. Analysis of coprolites, that's fossilized feces, from Roman sites shows high rates of whipworm, roundworm, and other parasitic infections. These parasites cause chronic illness, malnutrition, and weakened immune systems. They would have been a constant drain on the health of the Roman population. Fish tapeworms were particularly common, probably because Romans loved their fermented fish sauce called garum. This condiment was made by allowing fish guts to ferment in the sun for months, and it was used on practically everything. Unfortunately, the process didn't kill tapeworm eggs, so Romans were essentially spreading parasites across their food supply. The Romans also faced periodic catastrophic epidemics that went far beyond endemic parasites. The most famous of these was the Antonine Plague, which struck the empire in 165 AD. The Antonine Plague, probably smallpox though scholars still debate this, arrived in Rome with soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. It spread rapidly through the densely populated city, killing perhaps a quarter of those infected. Contemporary accounts describe bodies piling up faster than they could be burned or buried. Galen, the most famous physician of the era, fled Rome to escape the contagion. Estimates suggest that the Antonine Plague killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people across the Roman Empire. Some scholars believe it killed as many as a third of the population in affected areas. The military was devastated. The economy collapsed. The empire never fully recovered its previous vitality. What does this have to do with sanitation? More than you might think. Dense urban populations are vulnerable to epidemic disease. The same factors that made Rome possible, its massive population, its concentration of people in small areas, its constant influx of travelers from across the empire, also made it a perfect breeding ground for pathogens. Better sanitation might have reduced the background level of disease, but it couldn't prevent epidemics from spreading once they arrived. And in some ways, Roman sanitation practices may have made epidemics worse. The public latrines, those social gathering places where Romans networked while relieving themselves, were perfect transmission vectors for diseases spread through fecal-oral contact. The shared sponges were practically designed to spread intestinal infections. The open sewers, running through the streets, could carry pathogens throughout the city. The Antonine Plague was followed about 80 years later by the Plague of Cyprian. This epidemic, which struck in 249 AD and continued for nearly 2 decades, may have been even more devastating than its predecessor. Contemporary accounts describe thousands dying daily in Rome alone. Bodies were stacked in streets. The empire's institutions began to crack under the strain. Some historians believe the plague of Cyprian was a form of hemorrhagic fever, possibly related to modern Ebola. Others think it was measles or smallpox. Whatever it was catastrophic. At its peak, the plague was reportedly killing 5,000 people per day in the city of Rome alone. By the time the plague of Cyprian ran its course, the Roman Empire was fundamentally changed. The population had crashed. The economy was shattered. The military could barely function. The great building projects that had characterized earlier centuries came to an end. Rome was still an empire, but it was an empire in decline. And through it all, the Cloaca Maxima kept flowing. The public latrines stayed open. The fullers kept stomping in their urine vats. The night soil collectors kept making their rounds. The system kept functioning, even as everything around it fell apart. This is one of the most remarkable things about Roman sanitation. Its durability. The infrastructure that Romans built in the centuries before Christ continued to function through plagues, civil wars, invasions, and the eventual fall of the Western Empire. The Cloaca Maxima, that great drain begun in 600 BC, continued to carry water through Rome for the next 2.5 millennia. But let's be clear about what continued to function means. The system was never really maintained after the fall of the Western Empire in 476 AD. New construction stopped. Repairs became infrequent. The sophisticated water management that had kept the sewers flowing depended on aqueducts that were themselves falling into disrepair. By the medieval period, Rome was a shadow of its former self. The population had crashed from over 1 million to perhaps 30,000. Many of the public buildings had been stripped for building materials. The great baths stood empty. The public latrines were abandoned. And yet the sewers remained. The Cloaca Maxima, overbuilt to a degree that seems almost absurd, continued to drain water from the low-lying areas of the city. It didn't function as well as it once had. Sections collapsed. Others became blocked. But the basic infrastructure survived. This is actually unusual in the history of infrastructure. Most ancient systems require constant maintenance and rebuild. The Cloaca Maxima is exceptional in its longevity, a testament to the quality of Roman engineering and the durability of their construction methods. The stones they chose, the angles they calculated, the drainage patterns they established, all of it was done with such precision that the system outlasted the civilization that built it. Today, you can still see portions of the Cloaca Maxima in Rome. The main outflow, where the sewer empties into the Tiber, is visible from certain vantage points. Tours take visitors into accessible portions of the ancient tunnels. It's one of the oldest functioning pieces of infrastructure on Earth, and it's still doing basically the same job it was designed to do 26 centuries ago. But here's what I want you to think about. For over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, Europe had nothing comparable to Roman sanitation. The medieval cities that grew up on the ruins of the empire were, by every measure, filthier than Rome had been. Open sewers ran through streets. Human waste accumulated in cesspits that overflowed regularly. The kind of systematic waste management that Romans had practiced became a lost art. London in the medieval period was notorious for its terrible sanitation. The River Thames was an open sewer. Streets were ankle-deep in filth. The smell was so bad that wealthy residents burned incense constantly just to make their homes bearable. Paris was probably worse. The Seine carried so much waste that periods of low water brought unbearable stench. Even smaller cities suffered from the accumulation of waste that their populations produced. And the consequences were exactly what you might expect. Disease. Constant endemic disease, punctuated by periodic epidemics that killed significant portions of the population. The Black Death of the 14th century killed perhaps a third of Europe's population. While the plague itself was transmitted by fleas carried on rats, the conditions that allowed it to spread so rapidly were partly a function of terrible sanitation. Cities filled with waste and vermin were perfect environments for disease transmission. The rats thrived in the filth that medieval cities could not manage. It wasn't until the 19th century, more than 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, that European cities began to build sanitation systems comparable to what the Romans had achieved. And they built those systems only because they were forced to, by epidemic diseases like cholera that made the consequences of poor sanitation impossible to ignore. The Great Stink of London in 1858, when the smell of the Thames became so overwhelming that Parliament had to suspend its sessions, finally prompted the construction of a modern sewer system. Legislators literally couldn't work because the smell from the river outside their windows was so horrific. That system, designed by Joseph Bazalgette, was directly inspired by Roman engineering. The Victorians looked back to antiquity for models of how to build infrastructure, because the intervening centuries had produced nothing comparable. This is the legacy of Roman sanitation. Not just the physical infrastructure that survived, but the knowledge of how to build and manage urban systems. That knowledge was lost for over a millennium and had to be rediscovered through bitter experience. So what can we learn from all of this? What does the story of Rome's relationship with human waste tell us about civilization, progress, and the challenges of urban life? The first lesson is about the importance of infrastructure. The Cloaca Maxima and its associated systems weren't glamorous. They weren't the kind of projects that emperors built monuments to commemorate. But they were essential to Rome's functioning in a way that the Colosseum, for all its fame, never was. Without sanitation, the city couldn't have existed at the scale it achieved. The unglamorous infrastructure made everything else possible. This is still true today. Modern cities depend on systems that most residents never see and rarely think about. Water treatment plants, sewage systems, waste management facilities. These aren't exciting, but they're essential. When they fail, everything fails. The lesson from Rome is that civilization is built underground as much as above ground. The second lesson is about the limits of technology. The Romans built impressive systems, but those systems couldn't overcome their fundamental ignorance about disease transmission. They didn't understand germ theory, so they made choices that, in retrospect, were counterproductive. The shared sponges, the open drains, the waste dumped directly into the river that served as a water source. Technology alone isn't enough. Understanding has to accompany it. The third lesson is about who bears the costs of civilization. Roman sanitation worked for the people it was designed to serve. Wealthy citizens enjoyed private toilets, clean water, and effective waste removal. But the system was built and maintained by slaves, people who had no choice and no voice in how the system operated. The benefits were distributed unequally, while the burdens fell disproportionately on the most vulnerable. This too remains relevant today. Sanitation workers in modern cities often come from marginalized communities. Waste processing facilities are disproportionately located in poor neighborhoods. The people who deal most directly with our waste are often the least visible and least compensated members of society. We've abolished slavery, but we haven't eliminated the inequality in how sanitation burdens are distributed. The fourth lesson is about resilience and fragility. Roman systems were remarkably durable in some ways, but they depended on conditions that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. The slave labor that built and maintained the infrastructure, the constant flow of water from aqueducts, the administrative capacity to manage complex systems. When those conditions changed, the systems degraded, even when the physical infrastructure remained intact. Our own systems have similar vulnerabilities. Modern sanitation depends on electricity, chemicals, skilled workers, and functioning institutions. Disruptions to any of these can cascade through the system in unexpected ways. The Romans probably never imagined their systems would stop working. We shouldn't assume ours are immune to failure either. And the fifth lesson is perhaps the most fundamental. It's about what waste tells us about civilization. Every society has to deal with waste. There's no way around it. The question is how they deal with it, and the answer reveals their values, their capabilities, and their blind spots. The Romans dealt with waste through engineering, economics, and exploitation. They built systems that worked, extracted value from what others discarded, and relied on enslaved labor to do the work that free citizens wouldn't. We deal with waste differently, but our choices reveal just as much about us. We export our electronic waste to developing countries where workers disassemble it in hazardous conditions. We bury our garbage in landfills that will outlast our civilization. We flush our toilets without thinking about where it goes or who deals with it on the other end. The Romans at least thought about waste. They incorporated it into their economy, their religion, their daily social life. They acknowledged its existence in ways that we often try to avoid. There's something to be said for that acknowledgement. Not for the exploitation that accompanied it, but for the recognition that waste is part of life, that it has to be dealt with, and that dealing with it well requires thought, resources, and effort. Emperor Vespasian understood this when he said, "Pecunia non olet." Money doesn't stink. He was talking about urine taxes, but the principle is broader. The things we find distasteful are often essential. The work we don't want to see still has to be done. The problems we'd rather ignore don't go away just because we're not looking at them. The Roman Empire was built on many things: military power, legal innovation, cultural assimilation, engineering genius. But it was also built, quite literally, on human waste. On the ability to manage the unglamorous necessities that made urban life possible. On the willingness to grapple with the dirty realities that other civilizations preferred to ignore. When that ability declined, when the system stopped being maintained and the knowledge was lost, the empire declined with it. Not immediately, not all at once, but eventually. The collapse of Roman sanitation was both a symptom and a cause of Roman decline. The empire that had solved the problem of urban waste fell partly because it could no longer maintain that solution. And Europe suffered for 1,000 years afterward. Cities that had once been clean became filthy. Diseases that had been manageable became catastrophic. The quality of urban life declined in ways that would have been unimaginable to the Romans at their height. We've rebuilt, of course. Modern sanitation systems are in many ways superior to what Rome achieved. We understand disease transmission. We treat our wastewater instead of just relocating it. We've made huge strides in public health. But we've also created new problems. The chemicals we use in water treatment, the microplastics in our waterways, the emerging contaminants that our systems weren't designed to handle. We're better than the Romans in some ways, but we face challenges they never imagined. And we could still lose what we've built. Infrastructure requires maintenance. Systems require resources. Knowledge requires transmission. If we forget the lessons of Roman sanitation, we could find ourselves relearning them the hard way. So the next time you flush a toilet, take a moment to think about where it goes. Think about the systems that carry it away, the people who maintain those systems, the treatment plants that process it, the waterways that receive it. Think about the 2,000 years of human history that led to this moment, from the Cloaca Maxima to modern wastewater treatment. And think about what it means that all of it, started with a simple observation. Waste has to go somewhere. The question is where and how and at what cost. The Romans answered that question in their way. We're still answering it in ours. And the civilizations that come after us will judge us by how well we managed this most basic and most essential challenge. Because in the end, the true strength of a civilization isn't measured by its monuments or its military victories. It's measured by its ability to handle the things that aren't glamorous, aren't exciting, aren't the stuff of legends. It's measured by its sewers and its sanitation workers and its willingness to deal with what nobody wants to think about. Rome understood that, at least for a while. And when they forgot, when they stopped maintaining the systems and lost the knowledge, they learned what happens when a civilization stops dealing with its waste. It's a lesson we should probably remember. The Cloaca Maxima still flows beneath the streets of modern Rome. 26 centuries after it was built, the Great Drain continues to carry water to the Tiber. It's a monument to Roman engineering, more impressive in its way than the Colosseum or the Pantheon. Because those buildings were meant to be seen. The Cloaca Maxima was meant to work. And it does. Still, after all this time, that's worth thinking about. The most enduring achievement of the greatest empire in history isn't a building or a road or a legal code. It's a sewer, a drain, a solution to the most basic problem any city faces. It's not glamorous. It's not beautiful. Probably still smells bad. But it works. And that's what matters. The Romans knew something we sometimes forget. Civilization isn't built from the top down. It's built from the ground up. Or in this case, from below the ground. From the dark, smelly tunnels where the waste flows. From the work that nobody wants to do. From the problems that everybody has to face. That's where empires are really built. That's where they rise and fall. Not in the Senate chamber or on the battlefield, but in the hidden places where the real work gets done. The Romans built an empire on human waste. They rose because they could manage it. They fell in part because they couldn't maintain that management. The question for us is whether we'll remember that lesson or have to learn it again. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey into the hidden side of Roman history. This is the kind of story that doesn't make it into the textbooks, but it tells us more about how civilizations actually work than 1,000 tales of emperors and generals. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button for Ash and Crown History. We've got more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history coming soon. Stories about the people and systems that actually built the world we live in. Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought, what you'd like to see next, and whether you'll ever look at Roman history the same way again. Until next time, remember, every empire has its foundations. Sometimes those foundations are made of marble, and sometimes they're made of something else entirely.